Hi, my name is Candace Wheat, and I am the Technical Outreach Specialist for Smart Home America. I am here in support of anything that falls into my realm, but Brooke is in charge of running this meeting, but I'm here just to support in any way. If you have any questions along the way and you want to drop them into the chat, if it's something that I need to answer, I can take it from there, or if you want to, we can get Brooke to answer it once we get to that spot.
Thank you so much, Candace. And then I also have David Perks on me this morning. David, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. My name is David Perks. I'm the director of the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio, and we've been working in partnership with Smart Home America to produce the Resilient Housing Planning Guide. And so I'm here to support Brooke in the presentation today as well. So it's good to be here with you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, David. So today we're going to be talking about our Resilient Housing Planning Guide and then also a workbook that we are developing to go along with it. So just to give a little bit of background about the workbook, and Candace, if you wouldn't mind throwing the link in the chat where you can scan the QR code as well. So in 2017, after Hurricane Harvey, Smart Home America was on the ground helping with recovery efforts, and we really saw what it would look like if all of our workforce and affordable housing got wiped out by one disaster, because that's really what happened along the coastal bend of Texas. And so we were trying to brainstorm solutions about how do we help communities plan for more resilient housing specifically. And so we did an extensive literature review in 2017, and we were really shocked to learn that there were no tools to assist communities, especially smaller jurisdictions that might have little or no planning staff, on how to identify and plan for the location and development of workforce and affordable housing based on predictable natural hazards. So we're going to kind of go through the planning guide. I'm going to give you a high level overview of what the guide is. And then we're going to dive into the workbook and do a couple of interactive activities together. And this is our first version of the workbook. So we really welcome feedback. And like Candace said, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat. And we will have a nice discussion as we go along. So first, I want to give you a little bit of background on how we developed this tool. So one of the critical components for developing this tool was forming an interdisciplinary technical advisory committee. And this included scientists, engineers, municipal staff, consultants, and nonprofit professionals. And so in addition to that lit review that I mentioned earlier, we also performed a gap analysis and surveyed key professionals along the Gulf Coast. Then we were able actually to provide grants to 3 different pilot jurisdictions in 3 different states along the Gulf Coast to kind of implement the first draft of the guide and give us feedback that we incorporated into the guide that you see today. So, and we recently received funding from Fannie Mae to develop the workbook that we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation today. So to kind of emphasize the importance of why should a jurisdiction have a resilient housing plan, these pictures that I have at the bottom show 2 multifamily developments that are just half a mile away from each other in Lockport, Louisiana. And both of these properties went through the eye of Hurricane Ida, which was a Category 4 storm, and they were built by the same developer. So the complex on the left was built under an earlier building code, and it was severely damaged and, as you can tell, pretty unlivable after the storm. The complex on the right, however, was only about 90% complete. It wasn't even fully finished yet, but it suffered only minor damage from Ida. The damage was repaired quickly, and Hurricane Ida pushed back the opening of this multifamily complex by only about 3 weeks. And the best part of this news is that many of the people who lost their housing in the picture on the left were able to move into the new complex on the right, which really kept that economy going and kept that community going. And so this is kind of the importance of how do we plan for resilience on that community level. So, how does our resilient housing planning guide walk municipalities through the process of developing their own resilient housing plan? So, an existing housing assessment or housing vulnerability assessment is the first step. And this involves gathering spatial data to help visualize housing density and hazards relevant to your community. So, this assessment highlights the conditions and vulnerabilities of your housing stock and allows you to predict future flood and wind damage risks and factor housing vulnerability really into the whole plan's creation. So, this is step number one. Step number two is it's really important to gather community feedback throughout the planning process. So the next step is to create a land use vision map during a charrette or other participatory activity. And this will help gauge the community's priorities and opinions on potential changes to housing density, which I'm sure we all know can be a very touchy subject. So the goal of this exercise is really to include the community in the problem solving of how to balance housing demand and resilience. So once your community has maps and community feedback, it's time to start incorporating resilience principles. And so the housing land use damage and loss reduction strategy in the guide helps you kind of prioritize recommendations, clarify responsibilities, and really create your action plan of how to reduce damages and losses by adjusting the density specifically. So really focusing on how to promote resilience through land use. And as I illustrated earlier, it's also really important to incorporate resilience and hazard awareness into new housing construction and repairs of existing or damaged housing. So this graphic kind of shows the importance of building codes and having updated modern building codes and also building code enforcement. Because if you just have the codes but no one is there doing inspections or checking to make sure that construction is being built to those standards, it doesn't really matter that those standards exist. So especially along the bottom, you can see the years of the different houses. But this house up here at the top under the 2017 code, it looks pretty good, but all of the roof panels, it had metal roof panels, all of those roof panels blew off. So if water entered during that hurricane, even though the structure looks really good, it could potentially be declared a total loss by the insurance company because of water getting in and damaging the walls and the carpet and kind of all of that family's belongings. And then you can see the house built in 2000 is basically not there anymore. However, this blue house down here was originally built in 1970, but updated in 2008. And so it fared fairly well. And so this just kind of shows the importance of having building codes in your community and how to incorporate those resilience principles when you're building or retrofitting housing in your community. And so our guide really walks you through how to identify the right strategies for your community to decrease damages and losses during the construction or retrofit phase. And through our work, we've noticed that in many communities, recovery work after a disaster kind of proceeds without realizing opportunities to make the housing stock more resilient for the next disaster, right? Understandably, the goal is just to get people back into their homes and make sure they have shelter. So the disaster recovery housing strategy encourages your community to integrate resilient housing into your existing disaster recovery plans. This can be done by determining gaps and modifying your work plans. And this preparation before a disaster strikes means that it's much easier to incorporate those resilient principles during the very stressful recovery period. And then I'm sure we can all appreciate how important it is to build knowledge and consensus within your community in order to inspire a cultural shift. So the stakeholder and community education strategy helps your community develop short-term public participation activities, design an information campaign, and develop long-term programs to help support that cultural shift towards resilience. And so this is kind of the last step. You've created maps, you've gathered community input, and you've devised all of these resilient housing strategies tailored to your community specifically. But how do you actually bring them to life? So the guide recognizes that it will likely be a pretty gradual process, but a strategic funding plan can help provide additional opportunities to realize resilience. The guide helps provide a robust list of funding opportunities and guidelines to help you find even more. And by being proactive and developing a resilient housing plan, hopefully the application process for those funding opportunities will be less of a lift and you'll be more likely to get them. So, before we dive into the workbook, do we have any questions about the Resilient Housing Planning Guide itself? And feel free to come off mute or throw it in the chat. Awesome. So this is the cover of our workbook. Candace, if you wouldn't mind throwing the link in the chat and or you can scan the QR code. David, would you like to give a little bit of intro to the workbook?
Yes, thank you. So maybe one thing to kind of frame it a little bit. As Brooke said, one of the real important part of the process was the ability to have three different um, jurisdictions do a resilient housing plan with the guide as we were working on it in the draft form, and it was very helpful. And a few things came from that. One was we, really came to realize that for most jurisdictions that they're going to be employing consultants to do this work, and so that was one thing that we knew that was the case, but it was helpful to kind of interact with the consultants as well. But we also realized that that there was various sort of related applications, both in terms of how you needed a more sort of concise version of the guide, both in terms of how you would then, sort of reach out and engage a consultant, but probably as important, a way for the whoever's running the project, the planning director or whoever, also a way to be able to bring in other stakeholders, elected officials, and to be able to give them then a sort of information that was really a little bit more concise and a little bit more, I guess, sort of oriented with a kind of quicker read. So that was kind of one aspect of the workbook. But the other aspect is actually kind of what we're doing here today, and that is realizing that important part of this work is to also educate and to train. So the workbook has kind of multiple goals, and I think as we're working, and I think as Brooke described it, you'll see that it has kind of multiple goals, and we're still trying to figure out, how it reaches those goals. Certainly one is training, another is a way to educate. It's easy to imagine that one of its one of its real useful purposes will be for a jurisdiction to say, okay, I've heard about this idea of a real of a resilient housing plan. Kind of what is that, and is it a good fit for our community, and what would we do to do that? So in some ways, we see the workbook as in some ways a kind of a self-assessment or a way that a jurisdiction could go through and say, oh yeah, this is something that we could do, and it seems like a good time to do it, and here's how we might be able to do that. So the workbook, I think, as we are realizing already, has kind of multiple purposes, and so we are, kind of figuring out how to develop it so it has those applications. That's probably more than you needed, Brooke, but that's a little bit how we've been working on it.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much for all of that background and all of your team's work on it. So yeah, like David was saying, the workbook has a few different elements. So there are some activities which we're going to actually do some of them today that can be a little bit more interactive, kind of probably stuff you know off the top of your hand or information that's easy to find to kind of help uh, focus your attention and get you starting to ask the right questions. And then the assignments are essentially like your homework. They're things that might require stakeholder involvement or might require a little bit more work or digging on your part, but they will help you kind of create those strategies that I mentioned before. And then we're also kind of still working on compiling all of the resources because we want to give you as much information as possible. So first up, I want to know from you guys, And I'm going to start a little poll here. So give me just a second to get organized. Okay. So my first question is how might you use the workbook? Like David mentioned, we want it to be applicable for a number of different purposes. And so these are kind of the main purposes that it's for right now. And so to kind of tailor how we go about the activities, I'd love to know if you could answer how you might use the workbook. So kind of depending on your capacity, do you have the authority or the job description to decide if your community can do a plan or should do a plan? Are you interested in evaluating current plans? Um, are you hoping to kind of guide your planning process? We know, especially in smaller communities, a lot of times you have to work with consultants in order to create these plans. So, are you hoping to direct the work of a consultant? Or are you just trying to compile resources and develop those strategies to help educate elected leaders and stakeholders? So, I'll give you guys a few minutes to think about that and feel free to throw your answers in the poll. Awesome. Okay, great. And then, yes, I know you can see the second question as well, which is kind of why is your community developing a resilient housing plan? And I'm not saying you're developing a resilient housing plan right now, but just kind of why are you interested? Why did you sign up today? So we can kind of help tailor those activities. April, go ahead.
Hey, Brooke, and this may be the case for others on the call, since we're in sort of a train the trainer extension, we're not actually a community or representing, we'd be working with a community or helping identify communities. So
Okay.
it's a little hard to answer the questions as they are.
Gotcha.
But I think, if I could jump in, I mean, that's actually a really good point. And part of the reason why I'm pleased to be able to just be join in with this to kind of learn as we develop the workbook. Clearly, the workbook should have that used so that, because there are so many people whose work is to try to help communities become more resilient. I think the workbook should be very useful for someone like many of you whose work it is, to kind of to help communities know what's out there, how to make access to some of these resources. So I think that's a good comment because I think the perspective of this group is not at all unique. I think there's a lot of need so that those people that are helping communities also would understand, okay, here's how you do this, and here's a kind of path forward with it. So I think that's probably something even in terms of the workbook to kind of add that in as one of recognize that's going to be I think a real a real obvious use is for those people that are actually kind of doing that outreach work to help communities figure out what they're going to do.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much for that feedback, April. Um, And if you have a good way to word it, kind of based on the work that you do, feel free to throw it in the chat. Um, but just based on your guys' answers, I'm sharing the results of the poll right now. So we have a couple people who want to be able to evaluate their current plans, which is awesome. And to kind of help guide the planning process and then to educate elected leaders and stakeholders. So that might be a little bit more along the lines of what you were talking about, April, kind of helping bring this resource and knowledge to the people who are working in the community. And then the next question is why is your community developing a resilient housing plan? So like I said, you might not be in the midst of developing a plan, but it's more about kind of how you're approaching this workshop today and why you're interested in this material. So to aid in recovery from a natural disaster, to reduce damage during the next storm or disaster event, and to improve day-to-day housing stock. So thank you guys so much for that information. It's great to know. And so for the second half of our workshop, workshop today. We aren't going to have time to do all of these activities. I just planned some extras kind of because I wanted it to be tailored to your interest. So I'm going to pop up another poll for our first activity, and I'll kind of explain. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding the poll that I created for this. That's okay. So if you don't mind just throwing your answers in the chat, and I'll take a second to explain kind of what these activity options are. So we'll probably only have time to do maybe one or two or three with our time left today. But team development and plan review. So this might be for the folks who are kind of really looking at your planning process and wanting to review your plans. We're just going to kind of brainstorm who should be on your team when you embark on this process and as you kind of go through the workbook, and help you identify what plans do you need to look at, what plans does your community have, and kind of how do they tie into housing. Check your risk. I'm assuming you guys will probably already be very familiar with these resources, but I wanted to throw it in just in case. This is kind of tied into the first step of the planning guide, which is that housing vulnerability assessment. And so a big part of that is identifying your hazards. So I'm going to walk you through a few different resources to help you identify your natural hazards and vulnerabilities. The next one, analysis to action. So that's kind of what the next step would be after you kind of conduct that vulnerability assessment. And I'm sure you guys already have plenty of concerns or know of issues that your communities are facing in regards to resilient housing. So this is a little activity where we'll walk through identifying a concern and then kind of walking through what are the steps to get it to an action plan that you can take to your city council, your stakeholders, whomever. And then the last one is we'll do some brainstorming about designing a good public participation strategy, which is a big part of the guide and workbook as well. So if you want to kind of throw in the chat what your preference would be for the first activity, and then we will dive in. I'm sorry, my poll's not working.
Brooke, if that's the worst thing that happens today, that poll's not working, it's been a fabulous day. I think everyone could agree with that.
Absolutely. So if anybody has a preference, which activity we would like to do first? Otherwise, I'll just pick my favorite one.
Hey, Brooke, I'm interested in the vulnerability assessment.
Okay, awesome. So the check your wrist or the analysis to action?
Will you clarify?
Yes,
so the
absolutely.
vulnerability assessment is split up, is what you're saying?
Yeah, so the check your risk is just kind of reviewing some resources to help you identify what hazards your community is facing. And then the analysis to action is we'll walk through identifying a concern to kind of getting through to an action plan.
I'm interested in the second one, the analysis to action.
Perfect. All right. So for this one, I'm going to stop sharing because I have a whiteboard prepared for us. So we can kind of work on it together. Okay, so everyone should be able to see the whiteboard, and you can control your own zoom. It's in the bottom right of your screen, and you should be able to kind of zoom around. So I have this kind of divided up into 4 or 5 different frames. So we can find frame number 1. And then if you'll just kind of give me a thumbs up to make sure you can see the whiteboard and you found frame number 1 and it's at the appropriate zoom so that you can read it and participate. Thank you for those thumbs ups. Is anybody really struggling? Getting thumbs up and no crying faces. So I'm gonna say we're on a good track, but I'll give you guys just a few more minutes to make sure that we're all on the same page. Okay, so for this activity, like I mentioned, the first step is we're going to kind of pretend we've already done a more in-depth analysis. And I'm sure just based on your jobs and your background knowledge, you already have some concerns in the back of your head. So if you want to use a sticky note, that's the little icon on the left. It's like a square and the little corner is folded up. And if you hover over it, it says sticky note. So you can click on that and select whatever color your heart desires, or you can just do a little text bubble. That's the T right above it. Go ahead and write down a concern related to resilient housing that your community is facing. And so, the example is maybe a specific neighborhood is at significant risk for flooding risk or significant risk for wind damage. So often, awesome colonial communities in South Texas are impacted by flood. Awesome. That's perfect. We're concerned about wind events in southern Alabama. So great question, Glenda. Glenda asked in the chat, is this workbook activity done electronically with the stakeholders? So there is space kind of in the workbook to do activities similar to this, or you can kind of design whatever will fit best for your community. This is just me kind of running a sample of what this activity would look like when you do it with your community and with your stakeholders. So you might create a whiteboard or a survey or something to go with it, or you might want to run an in-person charrette or different activity. So this is just kind of walking through helping your stakeholders and your community get from analysis to action. And then we have mitigating properties to comply with elevation requirements. Absolutely, that's a huge one. And updating older homes to current building standards. Absolutely. Awesome. Does anyone want to hop off mute and share a little bit more about your concern? No pressure, but would love to hear from you guys if you'd like to add a little bit more details.
Hey, Brooke, it's April. So we have, these colonia communities that have inadequate housing that is not attached to the ground, and they've had these significant inequities and historical reasons why they don't have part of their municipal running water, or a lot of things that are happening, but they're often pushed out to the floodplains or in areas that are vulnerable anyways.
Yeah.
And so anytime they get any kind of precipitation event, they have frequent flooding.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is definitely a huge resilience liability. We want everybody to have safe and dry housing. So thank you so much for sharing more details about that. Stephen, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to add some details?
Yeah, I don't think I'm alone in this, in the sense that Biloxi, of course, is on a peninsula, so there are a number of older properties prior to BFE elevation requirements being instituted that may be slab on grade or have inadequate elevation needs, and so mitigating those properties to get them to the base BFE to lower their flood insurance burden is certainly a big component of housing mitigation here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so now that we've kind of identified the concerns that are top of mind for us, we're going to hop over to frame 2. And so for this one, we kind of want to think about how do we turn the concern into a general goal, kind of related to resilient. How do we take our concern, and our vulnerable properties into resilient neighborhoods? So examples could be reduce vulnerable housing in a specific neighborhood or utilize a specific mitigation strategy in a vulnerable neighborhood. So kind of thinking about how do we address that concern? And this is just very high level, big picture. We'll work on drilling it down later. So really big level, general goals. How can we start to address the concerns that we brainstormed? Okay, awesome. So some of our goals: develop education materials in culturally appropriate and Spanish on simple kits or ways to place sandbags or prepare their property for flooding. I'm going to assume that's you, April. Thank you so much. That's an awesome goal. Prioritize properties to determine suitability for relocation, mitigation, etc. Awesome. Absolutely. We have acquire funding for local government and homeowners to update buildings. Absolutely. Anyone else want to share about their goal or about their concern before we move on to the next part of the activity? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your participation. And next, we will move on to, so now that we have the goal, we're going to identify some more potential solutions. So we kind of, some of us kind of incorporated solutions into the goal, but this is just kind of more big picture. Sandbags are one possible solution for flooding. Can we brainstorm any other ones? Any other ways that we can help update those buildings and get them to the current code? So let's just kind of big brainstorm. You can use multiple stickies. You don't have to use just one. Kind of whatever ideas, we just want to get the ideas flowing and kind of get ourselves in the headspace to really tackle this. You guys are putting those in, just, some of the things that I was thinking about that we have listed in the guide to help get juices flowing is, increasing public green spaces. That's one especially helpful for flooding. Replacing single family housing with multifamily housing, that helps with density for flooding and other hazards. And then, like we've talked about, completing fortified and/or weatherization retrofits. Also, yeah, anchor housing and what a kit might look like for anchoring. That's an excellent solution. Develop a comprehensive suitability analysis for at-risk housing structures. Absolutely. And I will say our guide gives you a lot of resources on kind of how to do that analysis. That encourages you to look at your hazards, but then also look at your land use and look at things like foundation type and different things like that to help you do that analysis. So if you need help with that solution, the guide is an excellent place to look. Yeah, and looking at costs for anchoring, absolutely. And then educate homeowners on programs that help fund retrofitting to fortified standards. Absolutely. We are working, like I said, Fannie Mae helped us create this workbook, and they are helping us do our work because this is a big part of what we do at Smart Home America, is helping retrofit and get those fortified standards implemented throughout the country. We're actually working in 31 states is now our total. So thank you guys for your participation there. And then the next step is to draft a SMART objective or a SMART goal. So now we're going to kind of take all of the things we've been thinking about and really think about how do we address that concern specifically. So if you're not familiar, SMART is an adjective or acronym. It stands for specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time bound. So for my examples, we have that time bound over the next 10 years. We gradually want to reduce vulnerable housing in neighborhoods that are at a significant risk for this for a specific hazard. So that's the specific. And then using a buyout program. That's that kind of actionable in collaboration with a community land trust. Or another example, over the next 10 years, create a new green neighborhood zoning classification that enables compact, low-rise, multi-unit housing with increased green space and rezone 5 vulnerable neighborhoods. So any ideas? Obviously, we're not doing it today, but this is just, especially if you're working with your community or your stakeholders, or even kind of in a train the trainers way, to get people thinking about how do we get from the big picture stuff down to really addressing that concern. Awesome. We have create a hazard overlay district that explicitly identifies mitigation needs in land use ordinances. Absolutely. That is a great objective. Awesome. Yeah, thanks, April. So then we have work with 5 to 10 colonial communities on flooding preparation, workshops, and education, and aim to anchor 50 homes in the next 5 years. Awesome. So this is kind of like the steps that you would go through in that community charrette or participatory activity. And then once you have that SMART objective, this is where you actually go and create your action plan. So you might want to gather more stakeholder feedback, like take the objective to city council or maybe area nonprofits that are actually going to be doing the work and helping you achieve that objective. It's also really important to estimate local capabilities. What kind of talents and capacities are you going to need to obtain that objective, and how do you kind of build those relationships and connections? I'm assuming you probably already have a lot of those built, so kind of thinking about how to create that network to actually make that objective come true. Identify potential funding sources, which, like I mentioned, our Resilient Housing Planning Guide has that strategic funding plan section, which will help you identify those funding sources. And then you can really create that action plan to help bring that objective to life. So thank you guys so much for your participation today. I'll go ahead and close this whiteboard. We have a few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions or feedback? I will throw my email in the chat, and Candace can throw her email in the chat as well. As you're exploring this, especially if you have any feedback about the workbook, we would really appreciate that. We've got some funding to kind of keep utilizing it and do some more trainings in the next year. So would absolutely love your feedback on, do you find it useful? Maybe other things to include. So thank you so much for being here today. And like I said, please reach out with any feedback. Another thing we do at Smart Home America is we do a lot of education and technical assistance. So if you also want to kind of chat things through about how to bring those objectives to life, please feel free to reach out, and we'd be happy to chat more about your specific community as well.